Good evening and welcome to Diplo TV, everybody, a joint venture of Diplomatic Insight Group and SILKROAD 4.0. This is Dr. Farhat Asif. I'm the chairperson of the Diplomatic Insight Group.
Well, and I am Dr. Philipe. I'm the managing director of SILKROAD 4.0. So today we are more than honored to welcome Professor Augusto Lopez-Claros. He is the executive director of the Global Governance Forum.
Dr. Lopez has a distinguished career spanning over 3 decades working with prominent institutions such as World Bank and World Economic Forum. He is also the co-author of groundbreaking book, Global Governance and the Emergence of Global Institutions for the 21st Century.
And Dr. Lopez-Claros will be one of the keynote speakers of our upcoming 24th Global Future Summit, which will be held on May 16th. His speech will focus on reforming the United Nations and shaping governance structures to better reflect the complexities of a multipolar world.
And we are thrilled to have him here today to discuss his vision for reimagining global governance in these troubling times and how building bridges can pave the way for more cooperative international order. Welcome, Dr. Lopez.
Thank you very much for the invitation. It is a real pleasure to be with you today.
To begin, Dr. Lopez, global governance seems to be struggling in the face of challenging times and mounting global challenges that we are facing right now, from climate change to geopolitical risks and tensions, inequalities in the rise of populism. And how would you assess the current state of the international cooperation?
Thank you. That's a very interesting way to get this conversation going. I guess I have a series of concerns about the particular moment that we're living and the kinds of challenges that we're confronting, which largely remain unresolved. Let me just share with you a quick list. Obviously, I think climate change remains a source of great concern. Here, the data is, of course, very overwhelming, and just to pick one recent interesting report, on February 25th, James Hansen, who's one of the leading scientists on climate change, published a report in which he said that the 2-degree centigrade threshold that was embedded in the 2015 Paris Agreement is dead, he said. Global energy use since 2015 has gone up sharply, and he thinks that it was 2 degrees threshold is going to be reached by 2045, if not sooner than that. And this would lead, of course, to sea level rise of several meters, melting of the polar ice caps, and irreversible damage to critical ecosystems around the world. So that's one area, but it's not the only one. I remain greatly concerned about what is happening on the security side, what I call the unraveling of the nuclear order. We are living in the context of a renewed arms race. The various agreements that we had, going back to the time of the Cold War, limiting all kinds of development and weapons, nuclear weapons in particular, have unraveled in many ways. And the last major standing agreement, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, has an Article 6, which actually calls for nuclear disarmament explicitly. All the signatories of this agreement, which are probably 189 in number, have committed to this, and yet we're, of course, going in exactly the opposite direction. Nations, nuclear powers, are modernizing their arsenals. They're adding to them. China has made it more or less explicit that they want to reach parity with the United States and with Russia, and this, violates the spirit and the letter of the NPT treaty. I mean, this list could go on. I'm especially concerned about vulnerabilities in the global financial system. here there are multiple sources of potential instability to our global financial architecture. One that is of great concern to me is essentially what is happening to public indebtedness and the large, high-income countries. These countries, the United States, Japan, many of the important members of the European Union have especially high levels of public debt, and they have the potential to destabilize the global financial system. I don't really see in these countries responsible conversations around how we are going to have fiscal consolidation and the kinds of reforms that are necessary to maintain stability in the public finances. The list is long. I could go on. I have concerns on extreme poverty, on inequality. Let me perhaps put a stop to this long list, and we can come back to some of these issues as needed later on.
May I ask, because you raise really truly global questions, and I know that you've done quite a lot of work when it comes to the second United Nations Charter. Can you share your vision for this? What is the role of the United Nations, and how could a second United Nations Charter address the shortcomings of all these existing governance structures?
Yes, of course. Thank you, Philippe. As you know, this is a subject that is very dear to my heart. The Global Governance Forum last year actually published a vision of what a new United Nations Charter could look like, to meet some of the challenges that I have just described in my answer to the previous question. And I guess the principle underlying this initiative is essentially that institutions need to adapt themselves to changing world circumstances. In fact, when Harry Truman closed the UN conference in San Francisco in 1945 on June 26, that was precisely the point that he made. He said, this charter is going to be a living instrument. It is going to be adapted in light of changes in the global environment. And he drew parallels with the US Constitution, which by then, by 1945, had been amended more than 20 times, making possible such things as, for instance, voting by women in 1920 and many others, right? So in this revised charter released last September, just a couple of days before the Summit of the Future, we tackled, some of the areas which need to be reformed to bring the UN system into the 21st century. Now, obviously, this is a very substantial document. It's an annotated version of the charter with commentary explaining the justifications for the changes that we have proposed. But let me just give you sort of 2 or 3 examples, right? In this charter, one of the things that we do is we try to remove, obsolete parts. There are several chapters in the 1945 charter that are no longer operational. The trusteeship system, for instance, which was put in place in the old charter to manage the process of decolonization, that is defunct. The last trust territory became a member of the UN in 1994, and not much has happened since then. So you can drop all those parts of the charter, which basically are just like dead letter. They don't have any relevance in today's world. There are references to enemy states, namely Germany and Japan, which are totally anachronistic. Germany and Japan, for the last many, many years, have been the third and the 4th largest donors of the United Nations. It is offensive to refer to them as enemies. You can drop those references altogether, but that's the easy part. Then what we did as well, we brought in what we call normative advances, boosting the importance within the charter of, for instance, human rights. The old charter recognizes the importance of human rights. In fact, within 3 years of its adoption, we had the Universal Declaration in 1948. But still, we wanted to address what I call the Amartya Sen critique of human rights. Amartya Sen, a very well-known economist, philosopher, he received the Nobel Prize in Economics in the late 90s. He used to say that unless we have an agency that can actually deliver human rights to people and turn them into realities on the ground, then human rights are just, he said, heartwarming sentiments. They are beautiful thoughts that we share with each other, and we tell each other about the right to do this and the right to do that, but it really has no implications for people's lived realities, right? And so consistent with that, we have countries like Iran, which persecutes religious minorities and which imposes all kinds of constraints on women. According to a report released by the World Bank, which it was my pleasure to have directed, among other things, when I was at the World Bank, Iran has 27 different pieces of legislation in the civil code and in the constitution that essentially turn women into second-class citizens, right? So in the charter, we are trying to revamp the entire framework of human rights so that we in the future will not have situations where many countries are violators of human rights, and yet they are members of full standing of the UN. Then, of course, we have structural reforms as well that we propose. The Security Council has been the subject of countless initiatives for reform. It has two problems. It has a problem of representation. It only has 15 members. There are countries like Japan, Germany, India that get to serve on the Security Council once every long while. Switzerland got to serve for the first time ever a couple of years ago as a member of the Security Council. And there are 62 countries which have never served, right? So there is an issue of voice. There is an issue of representation. There are countries whose voice does not matter. And yet there are countries with very small GDPs, relatively speaking, and small populations like England and France that have served there, from the beginning, since 1945, with no interruptions whatsoever. So this issue needs to be addressed. And, we don't have the time now for me to go deeply into the specific proposals that we're making, but it needs to be addressed as the issue of the veto needs to be addressed, because there is an increasing sense of disquiet among the memberships that the veto undermines the credibility. I will go further, undermines the moral credibility of the organization. And as you know, the Security Council is completely dysfunctional. It is paralyzed because the veto does not allow the Security Council to do anything of substance, right? And at the same time, the old charter makes the Security Council the central organ of the UN system, right? So to have an organization where the most important component does not work is not very effective. Perhaps, not to extend on my reply for too long, one last example. The UN, as it was originally conceived in 1945, is an organization of states. We are turning it into an organization of states and peoples by proposing the creation of a parliamentary assembly as a kind of a second chamber attached to the UN system. Interestingly, you don't need to amend the UN Charter to create a parliamentary assembly. This can be done by an act of the General Assembly, because the old Charter gives the General Assembly the capacity to create new bodies, advisory bodies and other organizations to support its work. We think that a parliamentary assembly would bring in a degree of the democratic legitimacy to the UN system that at the moment it doesn't have, because the General Assembly operates under the principle of one country, one vote, and also because it represents the party in power, back in the capital.
Yeah. This is such an amazing insight coming from somebody who is a practitioner himself. And my question to you, Dr. Lopez, is that we are witnessing a very emergence of a multipolar world order, where power is distributed among people, global actors, rather than concentrated on few states. How does this shift impact the prospects of international cooperation?
Thank you, Dr. Asif. That is an interesting question. it seems to me that over the last few decades, we have seen two major power shifts. I'm going to use your own term. One of them, obviously, is inevitable and has been underway, for a long time, which is basically the changing structure of the global economy, right? China, India, for the last 30 years have been growing very, very quickly. And therefore, the relative weight within the global economy has increased, fairly substantially. Also, they have had, especially many of the emerging markets, including India, their populations have been growing more rapidly than the populations of Japan and the Western democracies, right? So you have seen this kind of redistribution of economic and political power linked to structural changes in the economy. One sort of interesting statistic that I sometimes like to quote, right, which is reflective of this shift. If you go back to 2000, which is not so long ago, 25 years ago, when you look at what percent of the UN budget was accounted for by China, right? How much did China contribute to the overall UN budget? It was 1%, right? Today, and for the next 3 years, 2025, 26, and 27, China's contribution to the UN budget is 20%, just 2 percentage points less than the biggest contributor, which is the United States at 22%, right? To me, this is very eloquent. It's a very eloquent statistic of this shift and the relative distribution of power and influence within the global economy and the global body politic. The other major shift, which I think is very, very important, is the rising influence of civil society organizations during the last many years, right? Back in the old days, 1945, and in the succeeding decades, whenever we wanted to precipitate changes in our global governance architecture, whenever there were initiatives for international cooperation, they were all mainly led by the states. In the last 30 years, that has changed in fundamental ways. The Landmines Treaty, negotiated in the 1990s, the International Criminal Court, the Paris Agreement of 2015, the Treaty on the Elimination of Nuclear Weapons of 2017, all of these major initiatives of international cooperation were started with civil society, not with governments, right? And so civil society now has become a very important player in terms of advancing reforms in our systems of international multilateral cooperation. For me, this is a major development. This is to be welcomed. Among other things, it leads to a greater sense of ownership, both by newly emerged state powers and also by civil society, to feel empowered and feel that progress in the future is going to be made to a great extent by initiatives which begin with civil society.
Very interesting. I made some notes while you spoke, and I think the underlying word that you mentioned several times that caught my attention was power shift. So if you look back historically, multipolar systems have often led to fragmentation or even to conflict. So I just wonder, how can we ensure that these transformational changes, these transitions, can promote actually collaboration more than just competition and conflict?
Yes. Philippe, it seems to me that there seems to be broad agreement. At least this is the sense I get as I travel around and I talk to students, I talk to experts. I was in Washington last week attending the spring meetings of the IMF and the World Bank. I participated at an event at the Aspen Institute, very much focused on some of the questions that we're discussing today. And it seems that there is broad agreement that all the global challenges that we face, to go back to the list that I shared with you at the very beginning of this conversation, climate change, the unraveling of our nuclear order, poverty, vulnerabilities in the global financial system, violations of human rights, and all the other things happening on the environment, and not just the rising emissions, but all the other consequences associated with the burden that we're putting on the planet. All of these things, all of these are global problems. What does it mean? It means that there are problems that don't recognize boundaries, right? There are problems, the solutions to which are impossible outside of a context of much stronger international cooperation, right? See, for me, that is the most important lesson, really, of this century, right? That these problems are going to overwhelm us collectively. No country is safe from climate change. You are not protected simply because you have a very, very high income per capita. Look at the fires in Los Angeles in January of this year, right? So here it is, California is the seventh largest economy in the world, and Los Angeles is a city of affluence and modernity, and yet people were running away from their homes because of climate change induced forest fires, right? So do we want to debate collaboration versus competition? Yes, we can do that. But in the face of these challenges, in the face of these dangers, it seems to me that the obvious lesson is we need to work together. We need to work across international boundaries. We need to sit down. By we, I mean everyone. Not just the US and China, the two last global powers, but everybody else. We need to bring Africans and Latin Americans and South Asians into this conversation because they are key to the solution as well.
Farhat,
I think this is such an outstanding conversation that we are having. And those people who are watching us, I think that if you have any questions, we will be, you can write on or under our conversation that is happening, and you can ask questions from our honorable speaker. So Augusto, Dr. Augusto, it's such an honor that you're sharing such important insights and helping us to understand the world, which is more blurred today. But in this midst of the human crises that we're witnessing, geopolitical tensions and growing mistrust among nations, what role an individual and institutions can play in rebuilding bridges and restoring the global trust?
I go back to something I said a few minutes ago, because you mentioned individuals, right? So individuals and institutions. So let's tackle one at a time. In terms of individuals, it seems to me that, all of us can contribute in some way because all of us participate in civil society organizations. I haven't yet met anybody of the people who work in or move in the networks to which I belong, whether it be professors at universities, researchers in think tanks, students in universities, or my next door neighbors, right? All of them in some way, identify themselves with some kind of cause, some kind of idea, right? Some of them are working to improve sustainability. Some of them are working to promote the rights of women and to narrow the gender gap. Other people are working on human rights. I know people who are working in the area of refugees and humanitarian assistance, trying to create a greater degree of tolerance and mutual respect across religious communities, right? So that religion becomes a source of bonding and unity rather than disunion and conflict, right? All of these people work through organizations, whether it's Human Rights Watch, whether it is Integrity Initiatives International. I mean, the ECOSOC, which is the body in the UN that lists civil society organizations, at the moment, I think has something like 10,000 members, right? When Kofi Annan in the year 2000 invited civil society organizations to come and meet to make recommendations to the summit of heads of state that took place in September of 2000 called the Millennium Summit, where the Millennium Goals were adopted, 1,500 organizations were invited to come and have that discussion, right? So obviously, we as individuals, can affect change through the initiatives and the enthusiasm and the power ultimately that we bring to civil society and these organizations. And then, of course, there is the issue of institutions themselves, And let me go back to something that I said before, because I think your question allows me to say a little more on something that I just touched very, very marginally in my earlier answer. A World Parliamentary Assembly is intended, to create a body that brings in a kind of a perspective from people who are much closer to the voters, much closer to the people, so to speak, right? And that would, instead of becoming a body where the members are simply defending national interests, right, and wearing their French hat or their German hat or their Japanese hat, they would actually be working across boundaries, defending causes and ideas, gender equality, human rights, environmental sustainability, coming up with more creative and better solutions to climate change and mitigation and so on and so forth, right? So I think that one of the more important ideas behind the creation of something like a parliamentary assembly is essentially to catalyze reform within the UN system by bringing in the voice of peoples, not just governments, right? Governments are an important player. There is no question about it, and they will remain an important player. But it is clear that major reforms to our global governance architecture are not going to come from governments, either because they have a vested interest in preserving the system, the status quo, or I think perhaps more importantly, because they're just too busy managing crisis, managing the day-to-day, managing, how to stay in power, how to win the next election, how to work within a very polarized political environment, which you see increasingly in many countries, including the United States, of course, right? And so do I expect from them creative solutions that will address these global problems? Not really, not too much, right? So that is why civil society will play a very important part, individuals in precipitating changes in the institutions that you mentioned.
I love what you just said. When I was preparing for the last Global Future Summit that took place back then in 21 cities, I learned a term, and that is a deskpert, not an expert, but a person who sits on a desk and then understands the world from a desk perspective. And I think this is the strength of civil society organizations, that they can bring in new, fresh perspectives from the people on the ground, from the real true problems that people are facing in the different regions of the world. And when we speak about problems in this VUCA world, I think everybody knows this volatile, uncertain, changing, ambiguous situation or times that we're living. I think we need to adopt to those rapidly changing transitions. And I just wrote down, actually, when we speak about civil society organizations, and as we are very happy and honored, Augusto, that you will speak at our upcoming Global Future Summit on May 16th, I was just asking myself, how can we advance this bridge building agenda during exactly this time of volatility? How can we as a Global Future Summit, as a private non-governmental organization, how can we push forward this topic in a greater meaning, a greater spirit?
I think the great value of something like the Global Future Summit is it becomes a very, very great opportunity to disseminate ideas, right? I always remember something that John Maynard Keynes said, way back, 100 years ago. Keynes, I'm an economist by training, and Keynes, I have always had a great admiration for him, for his intellect, for his progressiveness, and for the contributions that he made to the creation of important components of a global order as we see it today. He was very much the force behind the creation of the Bretton Woods institutions. He was the dominating force at the Bretton Woods conference during those 3 weeks, and so on. And that one of the things that he said is that the power of ideas is perhaps the most important thing, right? We think that what is important is armies and the capacity to destroy and to subdue our opponents. And he said, no, not at all. It's really ideas that ultimately change and precipitate progress in a big way. And so for that reason, I have great respect for the opportunities that something like a Global Future Summit create, for the dissemination of these ideas, so that we can enter into this process of identifying the global challenges that we face, underscoring their global nature, their systemic nature, and then beginning conversations, that are aimed at finding solutions to these problems, right? 50 years ago, I would have said it's a waste of time because the solutions are going to come from government. So if you want to change the world, become a minister or become a bureaucrat. No longer the case. No longer the case. The real power for change it resides in organizations or initiatives like the Global Future Summit.
You're speaking from my heart. I'm very happy to hear what you just said. So I'm an engineer actually by trade. So that's, for me, it's always very interesting to hear the different knowledge domains, how they see the different perspectives. So, and one question came to my mind. As an engineer, I would be interested to hear your perspective as an economist. So how does technology become a driving force in this shaping global governance? And for example, all these challenges that we are seeing when it comes to AI and ethical use of AI, and how can we ensure that those advancements in digital infrastructure and those cyber tools actually serve as an instrument for cooperation, and again, rather than exacerbating inequalities or conflicts?
Philippe, I think you raise what I think is quickly emerging as a very, very fundamental question, with the acceleration of the new technologies and this kind of dawn of a new era of technological development, But I think that for me, it helps me to remember that technologies and technological progress, is neutral. And let me explain what I mean by this, Scientific research, knowledge, can be used for very laudable, very noble purposes. We can use science and knowledge to lighten human suffering, to find cures for diseases, to promote human welfare in so many ways. But technology can also be used, of course, to create bioweapons, to create ever more sophisticated weapons of mass destruction, and that ultimately the aim of which is only human suffering and destruction, and to bring in death to our fellow women and men and children, right? And so, for me, the question then that this reality precipitates is basically two things, right? One is that it seems to me that we need to be very clear that what I would call misuses of technology, right, or malicious uses of technology are counterproductive. And let me, that seems like an obvious statement to make, right? But there has been a very interesting literature in the last, I would say, certainly in this century, right, of more and more very, very important researchers and thinkers arguing that, for instance, the nature of war has changed dramatically, right? War back 200 years ago used to be war and violence used to be instruments, for achieving political ends, because there was, huge gaps in technology. Let me give you an example. I'm Latin American by birth, right? If you read the account written by Jared Diamond, who is a professor in California, I think at the University of California in Los Angeles, in a book that he wrote a couple of decades ago called Germs, Gems, Metal, and War, or something to that effect. I apologize, I don't remember the exact title. But in that book, he has a very, very eloquent account of the encounter between Francisco Pizarro and a couple of 200, 200 sort of thuggish adventurers, right? And 10,000 soldiers who were there to protect the Inca Atahualpa, right? And his description is very compelling because what it basically describes is how, in a period of a couple of days, without suffering a single fatality, these 200 adventurers, Spanish adventurers, were able to subdue 10,000 Inca soldiers. Why? Because they had guns. They had new technologies which simply terrified the Incas, right? Okay, so military power, violence was used then and in succeeding centuries for subjugation, for domination, to expand your empire, for achieving economic, political, strategic ends, right? So what are the researchers saying now? The researchers are saying that the utility of war and violence as a means to achieve political, economic, strategic ends has greatly diminished, if not been totally eliminated. And then they give you the examples. The Soviet Union, a nuclear mighty military power, after a few years in Afghanistan, was forced to abandon. The United States was brought down to its knees and left Vietnam with defeat. How easy has it been for Vladimir Putin to take over Ukraine? The expectation was that he was going to be in Kiev within 48 hours in February of 2022, and yet hundreds of fatalities years later, those ends have not been achieved. And I don't think I am making something a particularly controversial statement by saying that he will never be able to subdue Ukraine, right? It's just not going to happen. And so this is one thing, right? That we need to understand and have a much sober view, right? That evil uses of technology ultimately don't achieve the purposes that you set out. And the other one is obviously perhaps the most important point, is that we need to restate the importance of certain universal human values, right? We need to put up front that by we, I mean everybody in the world, we have a vested interest in living in a world that is characterized by environmental sustainability. Whether you're Indian, whether you are German, whether you're Muslim, you're Christian, you're Jew, you're rich, you're poor, you are a man, you're a woman, rich, it doesn't matter. We all have a vested interest. This is a broadly shared human value. And there are others. We want to live under the rule of law. We don't want to live in a country where there are two sets of law, one for the rich and powerful, one for everybody else. The UN Charter already recognizes the idea of no discrimination based on gender or ethnicity, religious belief, and so on. That is the kind of world that we want to live in, right? And so for me, as long as this conversation about the uses of technology is embedded within this moral framework, then I think we can enhance the power of technology for human good, for promoting human welfare, for taking us to the next stage of development, instead of becoming, a kind of a Dr. Strangelove scenario, right, where technology becomes the cause of our self-destruction.
Yeah, Professor Augusto, I mean, your conversation about technology is such enriching. But while coming from a global south, I would not like to divide the globally division further. But my question and concern is that the digital divide has remained a major issue amongst the developing countries, especially related to, if you look at how the global governance is functioning. How can you suggest the mechanisms and the global governance mechanism that can address this division and address this issue of concern of the countries?
Several things come to mind. I think that, this digital divide, in many ways, reflects the prevalence of different kinds of inequality in the world. There is a great deal of income inequality, right? I worked for many years at the World Bank. I was the director of one of the research groups there. And the World Bank is an organization that, compiles the latest data on poverty, for instance, right? They are the ones who establish the extreme poverty line, right? And, the insights that come from this work, trying to understand the ramifications and the distribution and the prevalence of poverty in many different parts of the world, which contributes to this digital divide, is really quite interesting. Let me just sort of highlight a little bit one dimension of this debate. When you talk to people, journalists, sort of educated people who have an interest in poverty, they will often tell you, we have made great progress in reducing extreme poverty. Back in 1990, we used to have nearly 2 billion people living below the extreme poverty line. Today, that number has been reduced to 700 million, right? Which suggests that there are less people affected by this digital divide, right? And yet, if you're going to be honest about this conversation, you have to recognize that living in extreme poverty basically means living in subhuman conditions. It means you don't have access to the basic necessities. You don't have access to electricity. Your children are likely to be malnourished. If you're a woman and your husband loses his job, the following day you have nothing to put on the table and to feed your children, right? So it's a degrading and demoralizing form of poverty, right? There is an American economist whom I greatly respect, Nancy Birdsall. She makes a very important point. She says, if you raise the poverty line to something that is more reasonable, not $2.15 of daily income, but something like $6.85, 48% of the world's population is poor, according to that definition, right? So here we have a problem of poverty. It's an unresolved issue, right? He calls these people, this 48% of the world's population, strugglers, because they have difficulties meeting their needs. Their salary runs out well before the month is out. They are always, poverty becomes a source of psychological stress and suffering. It's not just the absence of income, which of course it is. Inequality has other manifestations. Gender, what's happening on the gender side is very perturbing. There are multiple forms of discrimination embedded in countries' laws, in the civil code, in the constitution, the labor code, the tax code. At the World Bank, we actually built a huge database, which it was my great honor to encourage and to build up, covering 190 countries, which allow us to tell you, as I mentioned before, in Iran, there are 27 different forms of discrimination embedded in the country's laws, which turn women into second-class citizens. So for me, part of the solution to the digital divide, has to be addressing these various forms of inequality so that we have more of a level playing field, so that people have the income to connect to the internet, to get broadband, to buy laptops for their children and school and so on. And this seems, well, this is pie in the sky, this is utopia. No, it's not. There are many countries in the world that have addressed the issue of inequality effectively. There are countries where women are protected, where women have maybe not perfectly equal rights and opportunities as men. I don't think there is a single country in the world that has achieved full gender equality, but there are countries where the gender gap is narrower. And there are countries where income inequality is lower, right? And therefore, there are lessons to be learned from the things that they have done, which have applicability in other parts of the world.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Augusto. As we all are preparing for the Global Future Summit, what are the key outcomes that you're envisioning and hoping to see come out from all those discussions that we are planning about, especially about global governance and cooperation?
Well, I will express one particular idea. You know, at the Global Governance Forum, when we launched the revision of the UN Charter last September, within that charter, we made a call for triggering Article 109 of the 1945 UN Charter. Here I need to give you a little bit of sort of historical background. At the San Francisco Conference in 1945, many countries, actually there was a group of 17 countries among the 50 countries that were attending the conference, that were very upset at the introduction of the veto in the Security Council. Because the veto, you see, essentially it's an idea that they had great objections to. By they, I mean New Zealand, Mexico, you know, so a number of countries. We're basically saying, you are asking us to join an organization which is going to exempt the 5 powerful members from the obligations and the responsibilities of the Charter, right? And this is not fair. This is not a level playing field. You know, the Americans, the Soviets, the English, you expect us to obey and to work within the constraints of the principles embedded in the Charter, but you can exempt yourselves from those principles at will simply by applying and exercising the veto, right? And we see how that principle has operated in practice. A very recent example is in 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine. It violated the Charter, a sacred principle of the Charter, which is essentially the inviolability of national borders. No country has the right, according to the Charter, of just invading another country and taking over its territory. And yet Russia remains a member in full standing of the UN because they used the veto, you know, when they were asked to leave, right? So to placate these 17 countries, and so that the UN conference would not end in collapse, they introduced an article 109, which says that the Charter can be reviewed through a conference. And this conference was actually supposed to take place within a 10-year period. It will not surprise you to learn that this conference has never taken place in the 80-year history of the United Nations, because by 1955, we were in the middle of the Cold War, and the major powers were not interested in rethinking and looking again at the issue, not just of the UN Charter, but specifically the issue of the veto, right? So we think going forward in the next few years, when I come to think, you know, what are some of the important initiatives that we could put on the table to advance this process of modernization of our global governance architecture? It seems to me that calling for an Article 109 conference is very much at the center. It is a very effective mechanism to begin that conversation, that global conversation, that encompassing conversation about what kind of a future do we want and how do we get there.
Very well said. Thank you, Augusto, for sharing your thoughts. So I'm always asking myself, whenever I listen to such esteemed experts like you, what can I do in order to make the world a better place? And so my question immediately came up. So actually, for our viewers, what is your message for those who are eager to contribute to the change on a global level? So how shall we reimagine the global governance in starting in their own communities even, or within their smaller spheres of influence? Do you have any thoughts on this topic?
Building on what I just said in respect to Dr. Asif's question, you know that after we released the so-called second UN Charter last September, we ask ourselves, you know, what is the next stage in the development of this initiative? And so the answer to that question is twofold. The first is that the Charter makes reference to a number of protocols which are now, as we speak, under development, right? So we're going to be releasing a protocol on disarmament, a protocol on strengthening the collective security mechanisms of the UN Charter. See, what people don't often realize is that there are articles in the charter, which never were implemented, right? The charter calls for a formal process of arms regulation and disarmament, right? Nothing has ever been done. It's there. Right? The charter calls for the creation of a peace force, an international peace force, UN-led, that becomes an instrument, right, to prevent genocide, to prevent abuses of power. That article is there. It's dead letter. It authorizes the creation of a peace force, but it has never been done. Instead, what emerged in succeeding decades was a very ineffective, very inefficient system of peacekeeping, right? Which I won't go into the details, has had some successes and also has had some massive failures, like Rwanda and countless other examples, right? And so beyond these protocols, the second part of this work program is that we created a coalition, a civil society organization coalition, which now has more than 30 organizations that have joined. And we are working together, not only at expanding the coalition so that it becomes a big voice globally, but also we are beginning to essentially engage with member states so that we can call for an Article 109 conference. And in this respect, let me end this question or this answer just by sharing with you an anecdote. Last February, just a couple of months ago, we decided that, by we, I mean people in the Global Governance Forum and in the coalition that is pushing this initiative forward, we decided, we want to have a meaningful conversation with member states. So we invited member states in New York to a closed-door briefing so we can basically tell them, look, this is what the second charter says. These are the reforms that we're proposing. And we would like you to basically move forward in this initiative of calling for an Article 109 conference. And, we did quite a bit of diplomacy, invitations. We built on earlier relationships. I had been in Canada giving a talk at the Canada International Council at the University of Toronto, and there were people in the audience who were very well connected with the Canada mission at the UN in New York, and they opened the doors for us to invite them through them, and so on and so forth, right? I won't go into all the logistical details, but what I want to say that eventually on March 19 in New York, we gathered 28 UN missions. The Germans, the French, the Japanese, the Italians, Kazakhstan, Brazil, South Africa, UAE, Portugal, they were all there, right? I have the list, but I don't have time to mention all 28 attendants. And you would have thought that given the current international climate, right, there would have been skepticism, there would have been, who knows, maybe even hostility at the idea of putting forward ambitious reforms of the UN system. Not at all, not at all. The conversation was high-minded. The conversation was friendly. It was as though nations, as our global order unravels and comes under great pressure, member states are more willing to consider the kinds of proposals that we've been talking about. And that was very encouraging. If I had one insight out of that gathering on March 19 in New York, with 28 UN missions, it is that we're living at a moment in history when possibilities are going to open for moving forward with the architecture of global governance, linked in part, to all the crises that we see around us. It is a kind of a contrasting message, right? But it is ultimately, I think, a positive message because change will come out of these conversations.
Thank you so much, Professor Augusto. This was such an outstanding conversation that we are having, and we would not like to end. I know many of our viewers who are watching. Thank you so much for sharing your insights and vision with all of us today. Your work challenges us really deeply about how can we all reimagine the global governance for a brighter future.
Yeah, also from my side, I have to say I could continue talking with you for hours. When it comes to technology, one of the activity streams of SILKROAD 4.0 is also to set up a course. Currently, there's one titled Understanding AI and Robotics and its multidimensional implications for the public and private sector. I will share the link to this course in the comments. And for those who want to continue listening to Professor Augusto Lopez-Claros, on May 16th, our 24th Global Futures Summit is coming up. And you can find all the details also in the comments and the link provided later.
Thank you so much for everybody to joining us. And remember that the power to build bridges in our collective efforts. This has been Diplomatic Insight and Diplo TV's collaboration with SILKROAD 4.0. And we all are waiting to see you in our future summit happening on May 16th. Join us there. And until next time, thank you so much. And we're signing off.
And then also from my side, goodbye and thank you all for watching.